screamed so loudly that the windows of the royal chapel in Warsaw shattered. Behind the walls of the marble chamber stood 3 lifeguards, each of whom was forced to cover their ears with leather gloves to keep from going mad. According to the testimony of Elżbieta Benke, the king's valet, the king screamed as if he were being skinned alive, then sewn back together and skinned again over and over. But at that point, he was only being prepared for a cleansing autopsy. It was only the first day. King Vladislaus III, known to the people as the Sorrowful, greeted winter one morning with profuse vomiting and purple spots on his stomach. Fearing an assassination attempt, the court physician Clemens of Krakow immediately locked the chambers and ordered that only trusted servants be allowed in. The king was given warm wine with opium, an arsenic ointment to rub on his forehead, and underwent the first bloodletting. More than half a liter of thick, almost black blood, smelling of rancid lard, flowed from a vein on the inside of his elbow. On the 5th day, Vladislav's kidneys began to fail. He urinated black blood, his stomach swelled and became hard as oak. His pulse beat so hard in his neck that the vein had to be pressed down with a spoon. The doctors delivered their verdict: internal decomposition from bad blood. Juice from Lucifer, wrote Father Stanisław in one of his reports sent to Wawel. He also noted, his eyes are yellow like a corpse's, and his pupils dart about as if someone were chasing them. Rumors of witchcraft or curse spread instantly. It was said that before the king fell ill, a bag of dried toads and a human tooth had been thrown into the royal kitchen. The cleaning lady was found dead, choking on her own tongue. The chaplains closed off access to the church premises. A black cloth with a cross was hung on the tower, and monks were forced to pray for 18 hours a day. Meanwhile, in the castle cellars, a struggle was raging between the supporters of the heir, the young Casimir, and the old magnates. Some demanded Vladislav's immediate abdication, while others claimed that the monarch's death would undermine the legitimacy of the Polish crown. Envoys from the Holy Roman Empire and a Lithuanian messenger arrived secretly, each with their own instructions. On the 7th day, the main event took place. The king, suffering from intestinal spasms, began to scream so loudly that blood came out of his ears. His stomach turned purple-blue, cold and bloated. A foul odor emanated from him, causing 2 servants to lose consciousness. A wandering physician from Plock arrived, not on orders, but on a sign from heaven, as he himself said. He was allowed in, not out of desperation, but out of fear. This man, gray-haired and with trembling fingers, ordered that the living king's stomach be cut open to release the putrid air. A guard named Faleski testified, "The king screamed like a pig at the slaughterhouse. He thrashed about on his bed, and the man dug into him like a rotten pumpkin, without anesthesia, without restraints, fully conscious. His stomach was cut open to the length of an elbow. The steam came out with a sound like someone had farted from the underworld. Inside, the intestines pulsed, blackened, and covered in slime. One piece of intestine fell out onto the floor and twitched. The king was pumped for 3 hours. His eyes rolled back, his mouth remained open, and he breathed like a fish. After that, he was carried to a small room, and stains remained on the bed that could not be washed away, even with holy water. That evening, no one spoke loud in the corridors of Warsaw Castle. The courtiers wrote their wills. A crucifix found in a baby's grave was hung over Vladislav's bed. It was believed to take away the pain, but Vladislav was still alive, and he had 2 more days ahead of him. Excellent. I'll start with the second part of the complete essay, 3 Days in Hell, how the Polish king screamed while his entrails were removed through his stomach. I'll continue without any abridgments. He began to scream on the 3rd night, not from pain, but from fear. The pain had already merged with his body and ceased to be an event. It became the atmosphere in which he lived, the stinking, hot, feverish interior of the old castle, where the walls oozed moisture and the candles smoked as if afraid to go out. The doors were not locked, they were guarded. By order of the Chancellor, no one was allowed to approach the king without permission. Even the confessor was checked for lice, and the doctor was kept under guard after each visit, waiting to see if anything happened. Ulcers burst under Sigismund's belly. His body exuded a warm, foul-smelling juice, like a broth of rotting flesh. Pus flowed down his sides like a slaughtered pig. It was known that just 2 weeks ago he could speak and give orders. Now he just lay there, and if he opened his mouth, it was to moan or try to get air out of his lungs, as if he were praying. But he was not praying. He was afraid. He was afraid beyond measure. Rumors circulated that the king had been poisoned with monastery tincture, that his insides had been eaten by rats sent by a witch, that this was retribution for the dozens of Waldensians who had been executed, whose flesh was now rotting inside him. One of the servants later testified under oath that one night he saw a shadow hovering in the chamber, whispering in Latin. He did not know Latin, but he knew he had heard a curse. The skin had a grayish hue, the lips were discolored. On palpation, there was complete abdominal atony, with rare bouts of contractions accompanied by the foul-smelling discharge of black matter. According to the records of the royal physician, kept in the Lublin archives, the procedures prescribed at the castle were typical for the time. First, bloodletting, up to 1.5 pints per session, then hot cloths soaked in vinegar, and St. John's wort. When that didn't help, they moved on to mercury-based ointments and bull bile. Opium was administered at night, but it soon ceased to have any effect. Sigismund began to rave, see faceless monks, hear the voices of his dead brothers, and the orders of long-executed heretics. "Lord, let me die screaming, not in silence," he said once, holding his hand on his swollen stomach, which already smelled of rot. Meanwhile, there was commotion in the palace. The Grand Marshal reinforced the guards in the East Wing. The reformed ambassadors left that same night, as midsieves were summoned to check for the smell of death. The king's eldest daughter, Kazimiera, begged to be allowed to see her father, but she was refused. The bishop sent from Gniezno arrived late in the evening, but was only admitted after personal permission from the chancellor. Political chaos grew along with the smell. "The plague," people whispered in the corridors. "No, it's not the plague," said the cook. "If it were the plague, we'd all be lying here with blisters. Maybe it's poison? Then who?" At night, just before the climax, one of the maids, unable to bear it any longer, ran away, shouting that the king is rotting alive and we are feeding him honey. She was never found. Others said they saw her being taken away by guards to an old cellar. "A mortal terror spread through the palace like mold," wrote the bishop's personal scribe in his diary. When he began to lose consciousness several times a day, no one even approached his body. They didn't turn him over, wash him, or remove his dirty bandages. There was hope that everything would resolve itself quickly, but he did not die. He only screamed. Every time the darkness receded, he returned with a new scream. These were not words. It was a sound like someone was cutting a live bull in two. The third night brought this scream. Everything was floating around him. He, King Sigismund, who wore a golden chain with 7 seals, was falling out of life like a rotten rag. And that was the nightmare. Death did not come. It lingered, and with it lingered those who longed for his end. At that moment, the world hung in limbo between fall and reckoning. It was at this moment that the real agony of power began. He wasn't breathing, but he was alive. His eyes were cloudy, like a corpse's, but sometimes they moved sharply, as if following someone in the corner. His mouth was open, his bitten tongue dangling, shriveled and blackened. The king himself had bitten it off in a fit that occurred on the morning of the 6th day. Before that, he had only moaned. Now he could not. His tongue was found on the floor, a piece of flesh with teeth marks, one of which had fallen out, and was stuck in the soft tissue. No one dared to retrieve it right away. It began to stink after half an hour. "A day of silence has come," wrote the maid Agnieszka later in her confession. "The king no longer called, asked, or commanded. He just stared. His eyes were round and yellow like rotten eggs. There was no longer a human being in them. The chambers were partially sealed off. Access was restricted, not only because of fear of infection, but also because of possible poison. Meanwhile, the body continued to exude fluid. The bandages were rarely changed. It was too dangerous. A thick black sludge gathered under the bed. Servants held bowls under the bed to catch the pus, blood, and intestinal contents. Sometimes it all came out with a crunch, as if the vessels inside were bursting. No one checked his pulse. It seemed unnecessary. His existence was measured by the movement of his fingers and the putrid wheezing from his chest. One of the doctors tried to administer a decoction of dill and sheepskin, which was believed to calm the inner storm. When the liquid was poured into his mouth, it simply flowed back out through his nose. It was then decided to pour a mixture of boiled honey and lamb's blood into his mouth. This was an old ritual intended to drive demons out of the dying body. But even after that, his breathing became slower. At the same time, a heated debate was raging outside the walls. Prince Vladislav demanded immediate recognition as heir, threatening to send troops into Krakow. Cardinal Gerard objected, arguing that premature recognition would undermine the authority of the royal council. Catholics and reformers accused each other of poisoning. Rumors spread like moss on a corpse. One of them even concerned the confessor, who was said to have given Sigismund a cup of belladonna infusion to appease the voice of conscience. At the time, a sarcophagus was already being prepared in the dungeons. The stone had been cut out in advance, back when the king was still healthy. But now there were problems. The skin on the body was decomposing so rapidly that simply placing it in a coffin would mean instant infection for everyone present. Therefore, the cupbearer suggested covering the body with wood resin and salt to slow down the decomposition. Servants carried baskets of rags soaked in blood and yellow mucus out of the chambers. One of them fell, breaking a glass vase of vinegar. When he fell, he vomited from the smell. He never returned. The marshal's report stated, "Those close to the chambers are no longer breathing through their mouths. They walk around with bandages soaked in herbs. 2 censers stand in the corner, but even that does not help. The rot is eating the air." The last day lasted more than 16 hours. The king did not move, but he did not die. His pulse was weak, almost imperceptible. One of the monks said, "The soul does not want to leave. It knows what awaits it." He said this aloud, for which he was expelled. But the thought remained. By evening, his body temperature began to drop sharply. Dew appeared on his forehead, small drops of cold sweat. Then his chest rose, as if for the last time. He did not cry out. He did not make a sound. He only opened his mouth, full of darkness, and showed that there was nothing left inside but rot. He was not immediately recognized as dead. They waited another 9 hours. During this time, the doors to the chambers were sealed shut. 2 people remained inside. One held a candle. The other was silent. Then they came out, closing the door behind them and saying, "He is no longer human." The body was carried out, covered with a black cloth. The head was wrapped in a cloak, so that the rotten cheeks could not be seen. Liquid sloshed underfoot, even through the fabric. His hands were blackened, his fingernails fallen off. No one stood in the street. Only rain drizzled on the cobblestones. The king was dead. But what would happen next? No one knew. The wind howled, and it seemed as if it was trying to say something about the future that was beginning without him. The next morning, thick smog rose over the city. The bells did not ring. No official announcement was made. The king was still considered alive, even though he had been lying in a sarcophagus for a day, wrapped in tar, salt, and cloth soaked in vinegar and church wax. The choir continued the funeral service, although the body had not yet been buried. The burial was postponed for both political and physical reasons. A suffocating smell emanated from the sarcophagus, which had been temporarily installed in the chapel. The floorboards began to warp. Someone whispered, "He rejected grace, and now his soul refuses to leave his corpse." The archbishop demanded immediate burial, but the princes gathered in the neighboring hall argued about borders, debts, and inheritance rights. Vladislav's soldiers, warriors in black and red cloaks, were already standing in Krakow. Their boots left dirty marks on the marble corridors. The guards kept their distance. Some knights no longer hid their swords. Rumors of the king's death spread throughout the city. Bakers stopped going to the dawn markets. Women hid their children. An unnamed town crier was beaten by a mob for shouting, "The king is rotten." A clerk from the archives wrote that night, "We are buried in stench and fear. Even the rats are running up the walls, and the cats are whimpering, not entering the rooms." The funeral took place on the third day. At dawn, the coffin was doused with a strong infusion of pine resin and smeared with a mixture of rosemary, incense, and boiled milk. It was believed that this would keep the spirit of decay at bay. But the lid was closed with gloves, and everyone wore bandages over their faces. According to the servants, by that time the body was almost liquid inside. Lead plates were placed in the sarcophagus to prevent the tissues from swelling. One of the undertakers burned his hand when he touched the decomposed skin, which had become as caustic as acid. He developed blisters. He soon died of blood poisoning. The funeral procession was short. Several priests, a couple of courtiers, and guards. The people were not allowed to attend. 6 men carried the sarcophagus. One of them lost his grip and dropped the edge, causing the lid to shift slightly. A smell escaped from inside. Everyone stood silently. No one dared to approach. One soldier lost consciousness. The king was buried in an old crypt under the castle, next to his nameless ancestors. There was no time to prepare a new burial site. A stone was hastily set in place. His name was carved on a plaque later, crookedly, with a mistake in his date of birth. A wooden cross covered with black paint was erected over the crypt. It rotted away within 2 months. After Sigismund's death, unrest began. Vladislav declared himself the sole heir, but the cardinal refused to recognize him without a coronation. Reformers from Poznan proclaimed independence from the royal authority. Famine broke out in the city. Grain deliveries were interrupted. People broke into barns and looted carts. One merchant was hanged at the city gate for refusing to distribute flour. Riots broke out in monasteries. Servants wrote that icons were weeping black tears. In one abbey, a novice was found beaten to death by his brothers. He had allegedly whispered curses in his sleep in a dead language. Prophets appeared in the capital, shouting, "The body has rotted, but the soul still walks among us." One of them prophesied of fire. A day later, the bell tower caught fire. It took 3 days to extinguish. An entry from the personal diary of a maid named Agnes. "We thought death would be the end, but it turned out that it only broke the seal. Everything that was inside, malice, envy, lies, burst out, and now it is here with us." Officially, the king's body was declared sacred, but the people did not believe it. His name was no longer mentioned in churches. His portraits were taken down from the walls. Even at court, he became nameless. He was spoken of as if he were cursed, and even months later, when a new ruler came and the court was filled with new faces, no one entered the chambers where he had died. The door was boarded up. Someone had scratched on it, "Do not open, he is not gone."